Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. On Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared to agree to a limited ceasefire with Ukraine. On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also appeared to agree to a very limited ceasefire. But where does that leave us right now with this conflict? Joining us now to discuss is Kupchan. He is the chair of the Eurasia Group and he oversees macro strategy. Cliff, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So before we started recording, you and I were talking about this limited ceasefire, and I know there's a lot of talk about what it is and what it means. There was the Tuesday call between President Trump and President Putin, but then a few hours after that call, it appeared that Russian forces were still striking Ukraine. Where are we right now with this conflict and this alleged limited ceasefire?
I think the limited ceasefire, quote unquote, on energy assets will probably take place. The Ukrainians really want it. Ukraine, through its drone capability, has caused Russia considerable pain with its refining sector. So I think both countries want it. There'll be a more specific list of targets that Zelensky and his government will come up with. Putin will probably agree to it, and I think we'll move forward on that. So on the limited ceasefire on energy assets, I think things are relatively positive.
Relatively positive. How soon could that go into effect? Are we looking at today, tomorrow, or is it going to take a few weeks to negotiate the terms of just this limited ceasefire on energy assets?
I think it'll take a week or two, probably, not much longer. We may need a delegation of Russians and Americans meeting in Riyadh again. But I don't think the target list on the Ukrainian side will be that surprising to anybody. And Putin would like to get that taken care of so they stop shooting at his refining assets. A couple of weeks.
And then what do you think a 30-day limited ceasefire could do in the broader context of this conflict? Does it offer any chance for a permanent and entire ceasefire?
Okay, so look, I think that this limited ceasefire could be followed by a more fulsome ceasefire. And in getting, people's arms around that question, I think it's important to think in terms of kind of three buckets of issues that the U.S. and the Russians are talking about. U.S.-Russia normalization of relations, which Putin really wants. European security, a reduction in the U.S. troop presence in Europe, which Putin really wants. And then third is Ukraine, which is probably the most important issue to Putin and the most difficult issue to Putin. But I think it's important to remember the first two buckets. And that will move Putin in his reaction function more towards a somewhat more durable ceasefire. So I think it's a really tough call. It's kind of a jump ball, but we get paid to make calls, and I think my call would be that we'll see a more fulsome ceasefire. Now, if I can continue for a minute here, so we'll likely see a more fulsome ceasefire. The problem is that we have to keep our eye on the ball. If you're moving money, the ball is, will this be a more permanent ceasefire? How long will even a longer ceasefire last? And there, I think it's important to be clear, in my mind anyway, that this war will likely go on for a very long time in some form. I spent a lot of time around Putin. I think he thinks that Eastern Ukraine is his. It's his view, right? And he doesn't want to leave the quote-unquote Ukraine problem to the next generation of Russians. We don't agree with that view. I don't agree with that view. But again, I've heard him express that many, many times. And so I think this war will go on in one form or another for the rest of Putin's life.
For the rest of Putin's life. What does that mean for Ukrainians and the folks who are still living there?
Well, for Ukrainians, for the folks who are still living there, and for global investors who are looking at Ukraine, and again, I have to distinguish my views from what I think. It's a pretty horrible assessment that I have. But, I kind of try to be genuine here. It's dark. It's dark. I think if there is a ceasefire, for example, I think Russian violations and provocations will continue. I think Russian efforts to destabilize the Ukrainian economy, maybe even, destabilize the Ukrainian leadership, to use, a euphemism, will go on. So I fundamentally don't think Putin will be prepared to live with the Zelensky government long term, first. Secondly, I think Putin's in quite good health. And I think that recipe is one of continued conflict in the region.
So what you just kind of outlined there might mean the cessation of bombing, but the institution of perhaps cyber warfare or economic interference or political interference over the next several decades.
Look, I mean, my model for this conflict is Kashmir, not the Koreas, but Kashmir, which is an on and off stable ceasefire, something that most of us would reluctantly call peace, on the one hand, with outbursts, some protracted outbursts at times of violence, as opposed to Korea, which has been a stable armistice, no peace agreement, but a stable armistice for decades and decades. And I think we're headed towards the former, and that's unfortunately a bloody future. And I think that's what we have to expect moving forward. And it's important to remember that as we discuss the ceasefire, because we're talking about a short-term uptick in Ukraine's fortunes. But I don't think it's going to be a durable uptick.
What do you see as America's role, either in the near term or the far term? President Trump famously said that he would end the conflict in 24 hours in his second term, and I think that's proven a little difficult to execute. But what do you see as the role of the American government here?
It's going to be limited, broadly speaking, but I think that Trump's potential exposure to the war is slightly greater than consensus in the following sense. I think the Trump team knows that if we're going to get a peacekeeping operation of any kind, and we may well this year, I don't know if it'll last, but we may well get one, right? That U.S. needs to provide some form of a backstop in this, some form of underwriting that peacekeeping operation. Now, we're not going to give them a mutual defense treaty. We're not going to let NATO in. Biden wouldn't let NATO into NATO. But I think that the last 24 hours, anyway, are interesting in the sense that Trump floated the idea, according to the U.S. readout of the call with Zelensky yesterday, of buying some Ukrainian energy assets. And if we do that, then U.S. ownership would be in the crosshairs of what is currently Putin's Exhibit A in targeting, right? And so I think it's more forward-leaning. It's not going to be a military backstop, but I think the U.S. is more forward-leaning in a potential backstop of a ceasefire. So I think that's really important. Now, let me just add one point here, that if we do get a more lasting ceasefire, on the more hopeful side, the chance that I'm wrong goes up, at least marginally, wrong on my long-term call about war. There's nothing like current realities to reshape long-term perspectives. And, if I were giving probabilities, I'd probably be at a 65% chance of, long-term conflict. But the chance that 35 remainder goes up if we do get a ceasefire, because it's harder to start a war if you're not shooting, at least marginally. So while I'm not very optimistic, I do think we have to keep a close eye on what's going on. It could have an upside.
You mentioned President Trump's call with President Zelensky on Wednesday. We saw the readout from that. He also spoke with President Putin on Tuesday. What is your assessment of both of these calls and what it means respectively for U.S.-Russia relations and U.S.-Ukrainian relations?
We'll start with U.S.-Ukraine relations. Look, a couple of weeks ago, when Zelensky got thrown out of the White House, U.S.-Ukraine relations were abysmal. And fundamentally, Trump doesn't like Zelensky. I don't think Biden likes Zelensky. He's a quite forceful personality. But Ukraine is a whole lot better today than it was a couple weeks ago. He's been rehabilitated. They had a very civilized call, which got, I think, an emphatically positive spin from the White House. So fundamentally, President Trump doesn't think this war serves American interests. And it's a legitimate view. It's not one I agree with, but I get the view, the Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump view. It's not our war. I think in that context, Zelensky's done pretty well. So Russia. Trump genuinely wants to have normal relations with Russia. Russia's another great power. We're a greater power, but Russia's a great power. I think some in this White House want to try to flip Russia away from China. I think that's an ill-informed play. It's not going to work. That's partly what he's thinking. For Trump, it's more that I think he really likes Putin. Does Putin have something on Trump? Probably not. I think we know by now because the intelligence agencies have looked into that and they didn't find anything from what I can tell. So I think we're headed for normalization. I think we're headed for closer ties with Russia. As long as the war goes on, full normalization will be possible. Sanctions will be lifted slowly. But I think these calls symbolize just a very different era in U.S.-Russian relations.
I've spoken with other experts who say that to achieve a long-term ceasefire, long-term peace, the U.S. would need to exert more pressure on President Putin than it is currently. Do you share that view? And part two is it possible for a president like President Trump to rise up and put that sort of pressure on Putin?
First, I do share that view. And now is a good example of a time. Putin gave a hardline fastball answer to Trump's initial request for a more durable ceasefire, a longer ceasefire. The answer was no. We'll try energy infrastructure, but we're not going further right now. So I think in coming days and weeks, soon, he's going to have to threaten sanctions or whatever he wants to threaten. Will he do that? It's a very tough question because fundamentally I think he's more inclined towards and thinks he's got more leverage over. He's more inclined towards Russia and he thinks he has more leverage over Ukraine. But to me, a deal and his brand and his image are his top priorities. And so I think if Putin tries to stiff him, I think the chances are reasonable that he'll rise to the occasion. And we'll get more leverage on Russia. And we'll get some form of Russia relaxing its demands. But that might take weeks or even months.
Is this a scenario where perhaps pressure from the broader GOP or the House, the Senate, could affect President Trump? Or is he kind of being guided by his own internal compass here?
Well, so far, what we're getting is maximum Don and a strong dose of it. And it doesn't seem like anybody or any issue has particular influence on him. Lindsey Graham has threatened backbreaking sanctions from the Hill if Putin doesn't bend. I have seen no evidence of life, no movement on the EKG, on the GOP so far. So I don't expect that. I think the greater form of leverage on Trump is internal, that he really doesn't like to be embarrassed. He really doesn't like to be embarrassed by his friends. And I think that, what he did to Colombia and Mexico and the Trudeau relationship, he really likes Putin, but he likes even more to get a deal. So I think that's where I would look for pressure to come from.
I'm going to go back to something you said about the investment thesis in Ukraine. Obviously, we are speaking to the Forbes audience here, a lot of investors. If you were a business owner or an investor, would you be looking at investment opportunities in Ukraine in the near or far term, or would you adjust your viewpoint?
Unfortunately, I'm very skeptical of the Ukrainian investment outlook, at least for the medium term, in years. If I was going to do anything, I would look for some kind of political risk insurance or war insurance, which really hasn't been part of the conversation yet, in Ukrainian reconstruction. Ukrainian bonds, that's a very complicated play that very much smaller section of the investment community is involved in, and it's a much more technical play. I'd even be skeptical of that, though. I think the downside risk to any play right now is that Russia starts shooting again, or that we're not sure when Russia's going to start shooting again. So I would be leery. I always think, what would I do if it were my money when I talk to investors? And if it were my money, unfortunately, I wouldn't go to Ukraine in the foreseeable future.
Among the other issues that have come up this week, as we've talked to experts and we've heard statements across various governments around the world, is the issue of Ukrainian children who have been stolen by Russian forces. I know that's a sticking point for the Zelensky government. What are the chances that those children get returned to those families? What would it take?
Gosh, if anything could do it, I think it would be a peace agreement. And that's a really embarrassing issue for Putin. It's a horrible issue. It's been carried out by somebody quite close to him. And I think it stands for, on both sides, but for the Russians included, the Russification of Ukraine. And that, I think, makes the chances of it getting resolved in the first phase of any discussion, I think, pretty low. But the Trump administration, as you know, has decided not to pursue kind of the war crimes angle on or at least that's what we get so far, on the Russians. And I think that makes it at least marginally easier to do. Again, not that I condone their policies, agree or disagree, but I think objectively, any leader that knows he's going to go to The Hague is disincented to make a deal of any kind. Trump's taking that off the table. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure that's why he took it off the table. But he's kind of cleaned up he's potentially cleaned up Russia's exposure. That makes a deal on the kids, I think, somewhat easier.
Interesting. So if we were to zoom out and use a baseball analogy, innings-wise, we're 3 years into this conflict, but where are we in terms of ending the game? Are we still in the first or second inning, in your view?
We're in the middle of the end of the third inning, maybe, middle end of the third inning. And if we're playing in my home field, the visitors are winning at least like 6-3. I think Putin's gained the advantage on the battlefield. He's got a lot more motivation, at least the Americans do. The Europeans are a bigger problem. We'll see if they can get it together and make that have an impact on the war. But it's the third inning of a long game. Could go to extra innings, and right now I think that the Russians have an upper hand.
Cliff, before I let you go, any other thoughts on where we are with this conflict and what the Forbes audience needs to know about the developments of this week and what could be coming in the coming weeks?
Well, the final point I'd make is, and I get this question a lot right now, is when are Russian sanctions coming off, and when and if the Russian market will open up to the investment community? And there it's going to be a more nuanced, in the sense that U.S. sanctions are what will be primarily in play, because this is about not EU sanctions. This is about Trump and Putin. And what I would caution is that we may see some sanctions relief, at least on individuals, lifting of sanctions. And what I think we're more likely to see, though, is non-enforcement of sanctions, the model being the Biden administration and Iranian oil. And that could look quite appealing if it's out there that the energy sector or whatever sector, aluminum sanctions aren't going to be enforced. But I would caution that non-enforcement is different than lifting. Lifting is reversible, but non-enforcement is subject to revision on ceasefire violations of any Russian action. And given that I think that the ceasefire, if we get one, which I think we probably will, is going to be unstable, I would, distinguish carefully. I would warn the investment community to distinguish carefully between relief and non-enforcement, and be very aware of the vulnerabilities of non-enforcement. So that would be my final point.
Cliff Kupchan, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate
Sure.
your time and your insight today.
Sure.